The hum of Washington, D.C., usually a symphony of power and ambition, felt muted that afternoon. Sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of her elegant apartment, cast a soft, almost ethereal glow. Karoline Leavitt, 27, and the youngest White House press secretary in history, allowed herself a rare moment of repose. The small, silver cross, a cherished memento from her New Hampshire upbringing, nestled at the collar of her crisp navy blue blazer, catching the light with a subtle shimmer. It was a quiet reminder of her faith, a grounding force in the whirlwind of her life. Suddenly, the insistent ring of her phone shattered the calm. The caller ID flashed. The president. Her heart quickened. This was rarely a social call. Caroline, President Trump's voice, urgent and commanding, crackled through the speaker. There's a situation brewing. A religious case at the D.C. local court. A group of Christians are suing after being banned from praying in public. I need you there. Observe. Report now. No room for questions, no time for hesitation. This was her life, a constant dance on the edge of crisis. Caroline's apartment, a reflection of her meticulous nature, offered no hint of chaos. Documents were neatly stacked, her wardrobe a testament to preparedness, business attire always at the ready. Today, however, she opted for a slightly more casual look. The blazer, a simple white shirt and black pants. But the cross, that was non-negotiable. It was a part of her, a quiet constant in a world of shifting sands. As she slid behind the wheel of her sleek black SUV, the urgency of the president's call propelled her. She sped through the D.C. traffic, the familiar drone of NPR News a blur in the background. She silenced it, needing to focus, to steel herself for the unknown battle ahead. A religious case. The words resonated deeply, touching a chord within her own faith. Don't forget to tell us where you're watching from in the comments and subscribe to stay updated on all our stories. Caroline pushed through the heavy glass doors of the D.C. local court and was immediately assaulted by a cacophony of sound and a wave of stifling, stagnant air. The murmurs of the waiting crowd, a mix of citizens facing minor offenses, traffic violations, contract disputes, mingled with the rhythmic clatter of keyboards from the clerk's corner. It was organized chaos, a far cry from the polished halls of the White House. She glanced at her watch, 2:53 p.m. Mere minutes remained before the hearing Trump was so concerned about. Choosing a hard, wooden chair in the middle row, she settled in, her document bag at her feet, her phone already open to a fresh note. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom, harsh and unforgiving, caught the silver cross at her neck, making it glint. She didn't notice the subtle shift in the room, the way eyes, curious and appraising, began to fixate on her. The courtroom itself was cramped, almost claustrophobic, despite its decent size. A middle-aged man sporting a rather bold "I Am King" t-shirt sat a few seats away, engrossed in his phone. To her right, a young woman, adorned with a necklace that could rival a chandelier, whispered urgently to her lawyer. Caroline frowned inwardly. The dress code here was lax, to say the least. But her focus remained sharp, her mission clear. Document the details of this Christian group's fight for their right to pray in a local park. This was the kind of issue Trump thrived on, a potential symbol for his conservative base, and she was his eyes and ears. The heavy wooden door behind the judge's bench swung open with a creak, and Judge Charles Hargrove entered. At 62, he exuded an air of rigid authority. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, wire-rimmed glasses perched precariously on his nose, and his black robe pressed to an almost unnatural flatness. The room fell silent, a hush descending as he took his seat, his cold, sharp eyes scanning the assembled crowd. "All rise," bellowed James Wilson, a tall, imposing black bailiff, with a voice that could command respect in any room. Caroline stood with the others, phone still in hand, her gaze fixed on Hargrove. He banged his gavel, the sharp sound echoing through the room, signaling the start of the session. "This is a court of law," he declared, his voice deep and cutting, like a well-honed blade. not a place to showcase your personalities. Hargrove began calling cases with a brisk, almost mechanical efficiency. A man fined for parking in a no parking zone. $50, no argument. A woman behind on rent payments. A stern warning. Karoline meticulously took notes, observing Hargrove's style. He ran his courtroom like a well-oiled machine, efficient, yes, but utterly devoid of warmth. She glanced back at the man in the "I Am King" t-shirt. He was called forward to present a neighbor dispute, and Hargrove said nothing about his flamboyant attire. The woman with the oversized necklace? Also ignored. A knot of unease tightened in Karoline's stomach. Something wasn't right. Then Hargrove's gaze locked onto her. He stopped mid-sentence. His hand, which had been flipping through papers, froze. His eyes, magnified behind the wire-rimmed glasses, narrowed, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice icy, yet tinged with a hint of hesitation. He clearly recognized her from the White House press briefings. Karoline looked up, unsurprised, rising to her feet with a natural, composed grace. The murmurs in the courtroom rose again, a wave of whispered recognition spreading through the crowd. "That cross," Hargrove said, pointing a long, bony finger at her neck, his tone hardening. "It doesn't belong here. This courtroom is a neutral space, not a place for displays of faith." Karoline glanced around, her eyes scanning the walls. There were no signs prohibiting religious symbols. "I'm Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary," she replied, her voice clear and confident, ringing through the silent courtroom. "I'm here to observe a case as part of my job. This is a personal item protected by the First Amendment. I'm violating no rules." Hargrove's face tightened, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. "Work? This is not the place to wear that and cause trouble. This courtroom is neutral, not a church." He banged his gavel again, the sound sharp and emphatic, as if to punctuate his authority. James Wilson, the bailiff, stood near the bench, his head tilted slightly, observing the exchange with a keen, experienced eye. Mrs. Thompson, the middle-aged court clerk, her graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, paused in her typing, her gaze shifting to Karoline with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Even the man in the "I Am King" t-shirt and the woman with the oversized necklace were whispering to each other, their expressions reflecting a shared sense of surprise that Hargrove hadn't commented on their attire. Karoline stood her ground, gripping her phone tightly. She realized, with a chilling certainty, that this wasn't just about her. It was about the cross itself, a symbol that Hargrove, clearly, visibly, despised. "Sir," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I have the right to wear this under the First Amendment." Hargrove cut her off abruptly. "Don't lecture me on the law. Step up to the bench, now." The courtroom held its collective breath. Karoline took a deep, steadying breath and stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the worn wooden floor of the D.C. local court. The room was utterly silent, every eye riveted on her. The silver cross on her navy blazer collar glimmered under the harsh fluorescent lights, a tiny defiant flame against the gathering storm. Judge Charles Hargrove sat elevated, his eyes, magnified by his glasses, narrowed further. His face was beginning to flush with anger. "So," he began, his voice low but sharp, a razor's edge barely concealed. "What exactly are you doing here with that thing, Miss Leavitt?" He was clearly trying to maintain a semblance of judicial authority, but the underlying disdain was unmistakable. "Sir, I'm here on duty, and I have the right to wear it," she replied, still clutching her phone, her thumb discreetly activating the recording function. This was escalating quickly, and she needed a record. Hargrove banged his gavel on the desk, the sound reverberating through the silent courtroom. "I've seen plenty of people like you," he sneered, "thinking faith gives them the right to disrupt anywhere. This is my courtroom, and I say it's not allowed." He leaned forward, his grip tightening on the gavel. "Do you know this behavior constitutes contempt of court?" Karoline frowned, quickly scanning the room again. The man in the "I Am King" t-shirt sat there, unnoticed. The woman with the ostentatious necklace whispered to her lawyer, also ignored. Yet her tiny cross, a symbol of her faith, was the problem. "Sir, I'm not disrupting anything," she replied, her voice remaining steady, controlled. "I'm here for work, and my attire is not affecting anyone. If you have a specific rule banning religious symbols, I'd like to see it in writing." Hargrove smirked, a cold, humorless twist of his lips. "A rule? I am the rule here. You walked into my courtroom with that, disrespecting the law, and now you dare demand a document." He banged the gavel again with such force that Mrs. Thompson, the clerk, flinched, her fingers pausing over her keyboard. The murmurs in the courtroom began to rise again, a wave of hushed conversations. An older man in the back row shook his head, whispering to his neighbor, "That necklace over there is bigger. Why isn't anyone saying anything?" James Wilson, the bailiff, stood near the bench, his head tilted, his expression thoughtful. He'd worked in this courtroom for 15 years, and Hargrove's laser focus on Karoline felt familiar. It wasn't the first time he'd witnessed this particular brand of bias. Karoline took another deep breath, realizing that a direct confrontation wouldn't sway Hargrove. She needed a different tactic. She needed the long game. "Sir," she said, her hand subtly adjusting her phone to ensure the recording continued uninterrupted, "if I've broken a rule, I have the right to a clear explanation." Hargrove sneered, clearly interpreting her words as a challenge. "Explanation? Here's your explanation. I'm fining you $500 for contempt of court." He banged the gavel a third time, the sound ringing out like a final, irrevocable verdict. The courtroom gasped. Mrs. Thompson looked up, her fingers hovering over the keys, her eyes wide with disbelief. $500? A young woman whispered to her friend. "Just for a cross?" The man in the "I Am King" t-shirt let out a small chuckle, but quickly silenced himself as Hargrove glared in his direction. "You'll pay today before you leave," Hargrove continued, his tone lecturing, condescending. "Maybe this fine will teach you to respect order. This isn't a church, Miss Leavitt, nor is it a stage for your performance." He leaned back in his chair, a smug expression on his face, as if he'd just won an uncontested battle. Karoline stood still, her sharp eyes fixed on Hargrove. "Sir, I understand your ruling," she said, her voice even, but laced with a quiet, steely resolve. "But I have the right to ask. Why aren't the others in this room with printed shirts, large necklaces, also being fined?" Hargrove's face flushed again, a deeper red this time. His hand gripped the gavel so tightly that his knuckles were white. "Don't change the subject," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "You're the only one here bold enough to bring a religious symbol into my courtroom. That's the difference." Karoline nodded slightly, as if confirming her suspicions. She said nothing more, but her mind was clear. Hargrove wasn't just biased. He was deliberately, actively targeting Christian faith. Mrs. Thompson resumed typing, but her fingers trembled. In her 12 years as Hargrove's clerk, she'd rarely seen him impose such a harsh fine for something so trivial. James Wilson stood near the bench, his arms crossed, his gaze shifting to Karoline, a hint of empathy in his eyes. He'd witnessed hundreds of cases in Hargrove's courtroom, and this intense focus on the young woman was different. It stood apart. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, more insistent. Some people were even sneaking out their phones despite the no-filming rule, clearly wanting to document this unfolding drama. Karoline stood there, still holding her phone, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't just about a fine. This was an opportunity, a chance to expose something far bigger, far more insidious. "Are you done, sir?" she asked, her voice soft but cutting through the murmurs like a knife. Hargrove frowned, caught off guard by her unexpected composure. "Not yet," he replied, his voice regaining some of its bluster. "You'll pay, and then I'll move on with the session. Sit down." But Karoline didn't sit. Instead, she took a step closer to the bench, resting her hand on its polished edge, her eyes never leaving Hargrove's. "I'll pay," she said, her voice low, but brimming with a newfound determination. "But we're not done here." Hargrove smirked again, but this time the smirk faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Karoline Leavitt stood firm at the defendant's stand, her gaze locked on Judge Charles Hargrove. The silver cross on her navy blazer collar gleamed, a silent, defiant challenge. Hargrove had just fined her $500 for contempt of court, his face flushed red with a triumphant, albeit shaky, victory. His hand still gripped the gavel as if it were a lifeline. The crowd in the D.C. local court held its breath, the murmurs fading into an expectant hush. Mrs. Thompson, the clerk, had stopped typing altogether, her anxious eyes darting between Karoline and Hargrove. James Wilson, the bailiff, stood with arms crossed, his head tilted, as if anticipating the next inevitable move in this unfolding drama. Hargrove broke the silence, his voice regaining some of its earlier bluster. "Did you hear me, Miss Leavitt? $500. Payable today. Sit down. We have other business." He banged the gavel, a weak attempt to signal an end to the confrontation. But Karoline didn't budge. She took a deep, steadying breath, placed her hand on the edge of the bench, and spoke. Her voice clear, calm, yet sharp as a honed blade. "Sir, before I sit, I need to clarify a few things for the record." Hargrove frowned, caught off guard by her unwavering steadiness. "The record? You've got no right to demand anything here," he snapped. But his voice wavered, a hint of uncertainty creeping in, as if he sensed something significant was coming. Karoline gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile. Not a taunt, but the quiet confidence of someone holding a winning hand. She pulled a small, gold-gleaming card from her document bag and held it up for all to see. "I'm Karoline Leavitt, White House Press Secretary, serving under President Donald Trump," she announced, her voice resonating through the now silent courtroom. "But what you don't know, Judge Hargrove, is that I don't just talk well. I know the law, perhaps even deeper than you might think." The courtroom gasped. The man in the "I Am King" t-shirt gaped, his jaw dropping. The woman with the oversized necklace whispered urgently to her lawyer, her eyes wide with disbelief. Hargrove froze, his hand, still clutching the gavel, stilled in midair. That doesn't change the fact that you broke my rules," Hargrove stammered, his voice losing its power, its conviction. But Karoline didn't let him regain his momentum. She stepped closer to the podium, her voice echoing with a newfound authority. "Your rules? Or your personal bias? I'm here on the president's orders to observe a religious case. A group of Christians suing for their right to pray in public. This cross," she said, gently touching the silver pendant at her neck, "is an expression of my religious freedom, protected by the First Amendment. You fined me for wearing it. But do you even know what the law says?" Hargrove's face reddened, then paled, a wave of panic washing over him. He tried to push back to regain control. I don't need you teaching me the law. This is my courtroom, and I decide." Karoline cut him off, her voice firm, unwavering, like a seasoned lawyer delivering a closing argument. "You're wrong, sir. The law isn't yours alone. Let me remind you of Church of the Lukumi Babalu I, Inkishal Boshfi, City of Hialeah, 1993. The Supreme Court ruled that banning religious symbols without just cause violates the Constitution. Do you have a just cause, Judge Hargrove? Or is it simply because you don't like it?" The courtroom fell utterly silent, a silence so profound it was almost deafening. A few people, despite the no filming rule, surreptitiously snapped photos with their phones, sensing a historic moment unfolding. Hargrove opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Mrs. Thompson held her breath, her fingers hovering over the keys of her computer, frozen in anticipation. James Wilson nodded slightly, a faint glimmer of approval in his eyes. He'd seen many cases in this courtroom, but never had he witnessed a defendant so swiftly, so decisively flip the script. Karoline pressed on, her voice now like a perfectly rehearsed speech, each word carefully chosen, each sentence delivered with precision. "You fined me $500 for contempt, but I have proof, right here in this room, of your selective enforcement. That man, she said, pointing to the man in the I Am King t-shirt, is wearing a printed shirt, clearly against any reasonable dress code. Yet you said nothing. Her, she continued, gesturing to the woman with the large flashy necklace. She's adorned with jewelry that could be considered distracting. But you remain silent. Only my cross, a Christian symbol, provoked your ire. That's not law, sir. That's bias. Hargrove trembled, his face shifting from red to an almost ashen white. You're slandering me, he stammered, his voice weak, unconvincing. Karoline didn't stop. She raised her phone, displaying the screen. I've recorded everything from the moment you called me up to this very instant. I've also texted the White House counsel's office reporting this injustice. You want to find me? Fine, but this doesn't end here. The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of whispers, a wave of suppressed excitement rippling through the crowd. Someone shouted, "She's right." Another person clapped briefly, quickly hushed by a stern look from James Wilson. Hargrove panicked, grasping for any semblance of control. Miss Leavitt, I can withdraw the fine. There's no need to escalate this. He banged the gavel feebly, his voice shaky, almost pleading. But Karoline shook her head, her gaze unwavering, her resolve unshaken. No, sir. Withdrawing the fine now, because of who I am, only proves you're even more wrong. The issue isn't me. It's how you run this court. I demand you review the past 6 months of your court records, all fines related to religious symbols, and I propose mandatory First Amendment training for all court staff, including you. The courtroom exploded. The older man in the back row stood up, clapping his hands and yelling, "That's right." A young woman whispered to her friend, "Who is she? She's amazing." Mrs. Thompson typed furiously, capturing every word, every nuance of the exchange, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of awe and vindication, as if she were witnessing history in the making. James Wilson smiled discreetly, a knowing look on his face. He'd known from the moment she walked into the courtroom that she was something special. Hargrove slumped back in his chair, his face ashen, his hands trembling on the gavel. He looked at Karoline, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a defiant defendant, but as a formidable, legally astute adversary. You think I'm just a spokesperson, Karoline said, her voice low but powerful, cutting through the noise. But I've worked with President Trump through countless lawsuits, from election challenges to policy disputes. I taught myself law to defend him. And now I'm using that knowledge to defend myself and others. You just made a very big mistake, Judge Hargrove. She placed her White House identification card on the bench, a symbolic gesture, and stepped back, her eyes never leaving his. Hargrove opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that he'd crossed a line, that he'd underestimated someone who was not just intelligent and articulate, but a legal force to be reckoned with. The crowd erupted again, scattered applause breaking out, a spontaneous expression of support for Karoline. Mrs. Thompson typed faster than ever, as if trying to preserve every moment, every word for posterity. James Wilson stepped closer to the bench, his eyes filled with a newfound respect for the young woman who had just turned his courtroom upside down. Hargrove sat there, defeated, his authority crumbling before everyone's eyes. Karoline stood still, the silver cross still shining, no longer just a symbol of her faith, but a banner of her victory, a testament to her courage and her unwavering commitment to justice. Karoline Leavitt stepped out of the D.C. local court, the late afternoon sun glinting off the silver cross that now felt less like a personal memento and more like a badge of honor. The clock read 3:30 p.m., but the air inside the courtroom still crackled with the energy of the confrontation, an explosion that had reverberated far beyond those four walls. She paused at the glass doors, checking her phone. The recording of the entire exchange had been successfully sent to the White House counsel's office, along with a brief, concise message to Trump's senior advisor. Hargrove, find me for the cross, handled it. Next steps needed. She knew this wasn't just a personal victory. It was a strategic opportunity, a chance for Trump and the conservative movement to score a significant win. Inside the courtroom, the buzz continued unabated. The older man who'd applauded turned to his neighbor, his voice trembling with emotion. "I've never seen anyone knock a judge down like that. Never." A young woman, her arm linked with her boyfriend's, whispered, "She's the White House press secretary. Incredible." Mrs. Thompson, the clerk, was hurriedly printing out the transcript of the session, her hands still shaking slightly as she processed the magnitude of what she'd just witnessed. James Wilson, the bailiff, had already left the courtroom, phone in hand, calling a colleague. "You've got to hear this," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "A young woman just silenced Hargrove, completely shut him down." The news began to leak out, spreading through the digital grapevine with the speed and intensity of a wildfire. Karoline hadn't even reached her car when her phone began buzzing relentlessly. A notification from X, formerly Twitter, popped up. Matt Crossan in court was trending. She opened the app and saw the first tweet, posted by someone who had been in the courtroom. "Judge fines White House press secretary $500 for wearing a cross. She fights back with the law and leaves him speechless." Crossan court. Within 10 minutes, hundreds of comments poured in. "Who is she? Unreal." "Hargrove's done. He's toast." A major conservative account tweeted, "Proof the system is rigged against Christians. Thank you, Karoline Leavitt, for standing up." Karoline allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. This wave was just beginning. At 4:11 p.m., President Trump himself weighed in. He posted from his personal X account, "Karoline Leavitt, my amazing press secretary, just taught a leftist judge a lesson in religious freedom. Legal genius. We won't let them suppress our faith. #MAGA. Shar religious freedom." The tweet racked up over 50,000 retweets in less than 30 minutes. Conservative news outlets, sensing a major story, pounced. Fox News ran a headline, "White House press secretary faces off with judge over cross and wins." Breitbart declared, "Karoline Leavitt destroys anti-Christian judge." Karoline received a call from Trump's senior advisor, his voice beaming with approval. "You did great, Karoline. The president is ecstatic. He wants this amplified. Prepare a statement. We're going to make this a national issue." Meanwhile, Charles Hargrove sat alone in his chambers behind the now empty courtroom. The dim light cast long, somber shadows on his pale face. His phone had been ringing nonstop. Calls from the D.C. Judicial Council, reporters, even old colleagues. He'd silenced it, his hands trembling as he held a cold, untouched mug of coffee. The clash with Karoline hadn't just humiliated him in front of the courtroom crowd. It was spreading like a virus across the city, across the nation. He muttered to himself, "She's just a young girl. How did this happen?" But deep down, he knew. He'd collided with something far bigger, far more powerful than himself. Mrs. Thompson, still at the courthouse, couldn't remain silent. She called a friend at a local newspaper, her voice low, conspiratorial but firm. "I have worked with Hargrove for 12 years, she said. "He always targets religious symbols, especially Christian ones. That girl today, she was right. I've got notes, years of notes, to prove it." She pulled a small, well-worn notebook from her drawer, filled with meticulous entries detailing similar cases. People fined heavily for wearing crosses. Muslim women warned for wearing hijabs, while those with slogan T-shirts and flashy jewelry were consistently overlooked. She knew she was taking a risk, but after today, silence was no longer an option. James Wilson took action too. He met with several colleagues in the courthouse break room, recounting the event with barely contained emotion. "I counted," he said, his voice rising with indignation. "At least 20 times this year, Hargrove fined people for displaying religious symbols. Rude T-shirts, he laughs them off. But a cross, a Star of David, he throws the book at them. Leavitt exposed what we all knew, but were too afraid to say. A colleague nodded in agreement. "I'll call the press," he said. "This needs to be out there. We can't let this stand." By 5 p.m., a Channel 7 news reporter stood outside the courthouse, filming a live report. Today, White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt was fined $500 for wearing a cross in court. She fought back, and now the city is buzzing. On X, the hashtag cross in court soared past 100,000 mentions. People began sharing their own stories of encounters with Judge Hargrove. "He fined me $200 for wearing a prayer bracelet last year," one person wrote. "I saw him scold a mother for wearing a small cross during a divorce hearing," another added. A prominent conservative account posted a short video clip, secretly filmed inside the courtroom, showing Karoline holding up her White House identification card, her voice ringing out with unwavering conviction. The clip went viral, hitting 1 million views within hours. Karoline sat in her car, parked on a quiet street corner, watching the news explode around her. She called her husband, a low-key businessman who preferred to stay out of the spotlight, her voice calm but laced with excitement. "Honey," she said, "I just shut down a judge. This is about to get huge." He laughed over the phone. "You always manage to pull off the craziest things. Just stay safe." She nodded, hung up, and opened an email from the White House counsel's office. "Prepare for a press conference tonight. We're turning this into a major win for religious freedom." Back at his home, Hargrove turned on the television, only to see his own face staring back at him from the evening news. "Judge faces backlash after fining press secretary," the bold headline flashed. He switched it off, his hands shaking. The Judicial Council had called, demanding a full explanation by morning. He knew his 30-year career was teetering on the brink, all because of a 27-year-old woman and her tiny silver cross. The next morning, the D.C. Judicial Council's office buzzed with activity. News of Karoline Leavitt's confrontation with Judge Charles Hargrove had swept through Washington like a shockwave, forcing the council to launch an urgent investigation. Linda Martinez, a seasoned investigator with 20 years of experience, stood before a long table, spreading out dozens of case files from Hargrove's court. Her team had been working nonstop since 6 a.m. after receiving an official complaint from the White House counsel's office, filed by Karoline the previous night. "We've got 48 hours to report back," Linda told her team, her voice firm, determined. "Find everything related to Hargrove and religious symbols. Leave no stone unturned." Karoline, meanwhile, sat in her White House office, preparing for the evening's press conference, a direct command from President Trump. She reviewed the courtroom recording, sending another email to his senior advisor. "I've got data from X. Hundreds of users accusing Hargrove of bias. Push this hard. This is bigger than just me." Her phone buzzed constantly. Messages from lawyers, reporters, and ordinary citizens expressing their support. A law student wrote, "You inspire me. Judge Hargrove, find my mom for wearing a cross once. You're giving us hope." Karoline smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. This was no longer just her fight. It had become a movement, reaching thousands, perhaps millions. At the courthouse, Mrs. Thompson entered the investigation room, clutching her small, well-worn notebook. "I've tracked 12 years of cases with Judge Hargrove," she told Linda, her voice shaky, but resolute. "He always targeted religious symbols, crosses, hijabs, anything that stood out. But crude shirts or loud jewelry, he let them slide." Linda flipped through the notebook, her eyes widening as she scanned the meticulous entries. September 14th, 2024. Man with cross fined $300 for disruption. October 20th, 2024. Muslim woman with hijab fined $200 for inappropriate attire. The pattern was undeniable. "This is gold," Linda said, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and grim determination. "Thank you." James Wilson showed up too, offering a handwritten statement. "I've been a bailiff in that courtroom for 15 years, he said. "Hargrove fined people wearing religious symbols at least 3 times more often than he fined people for other dress code violations. I counted. One day, he fined 5 people for wearing crosses, but ignored 3 people wearing vulgar, offensive t-shirts. Linda jotted down notes furiously, her team cross-referencing the information with official court records. The data soon emerged, painting a stark, damning picture. Over the past year, 70% of the fines Hargrove had imposed for religious symbol violations had targeted Christians, with an average fine of $250, more than double the penalty for other dress code breaches. Charles Hargrove, meanwhile, sat in his home office, facing the Judicial Council via a Zoom call. I didn't mean to be biased, he said, his voice weak, his hands cradling his head. Linda presented the data, her voice calm but firm. Mr. Hargrove, records show you fined people wearing crosses 80% more harshly than you fined people for similar violations. How do you explain that? How do you? Hargrove fell silent, his eyes downcast. He recalled Karoline Leavitt, her steely gaze, her sharp, incisive reasoning, her unwavering citation of the First Amendment and the Church of the Lukumi Babaluai precedent. I didn't realize, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. I thought I was maintaining order. By noon, Linda's preliminary report was complete. This isn't just Hargrove, she told the council. We found 3 other D.C. judges with similar tendencies, although less pronounced. But Hargrove is the clearest case. A pattern of bias against religious expression, especially Christianity. The council ordered Hargrove's immediate suspension, pending a final ruling. News of the suspension leaked out, and X erupted again. #CrossingCourt surged back to the top of the trending list. Hargrove suspended. Karoline Leavitt shakes the system, one user posted. A conservative account tweeted, Trump's legal genius wins again. Religious freedom prevails. Karoline stood before the mirror in the White House briefing room at 6:30 p.m., adjusting her blazer, the silver cross gleaming under the bright lights. Trump walked in, clapping her on the shoulder. You made me proud, Karoline. You really stuck it to them. Tonight, we show them that religious freedom is untouchable in this country. She nodded, her expression determined, and stepped to the podium, facing a sea of reporters, cameras flashing, a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. Yesterday, she began, her voice resonating through the room. I was fined for wearing a cross, not because I was doing anything wrong, but because a judge thought he was above the law. I fought back, not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been treated unfairly for their faith. The press corps buzzed with questions, a barrage of inquiries flying at her. But she answered calmly, confidently, citing legal precedent, referencing the overwhelming data from X, highlighting the systemic bias that had been exposed. Hargrove watched the briefing on television, his hands trembling. He turned it off, sitting in darkness, his phone overflowing with messages, colleagues distancing themselves, reporters hounding him for comment. But what shocked him most was the testimony of Mrs. Thompson and James Wilson, people he'd trusted, people he'd considered loyal. He opened his laptop, searching for the Church of the Lukumi Babaluai ruling, the very precedent Karoline had cited. He read it, slowly, carefully, and sighed. She's right, he murmured. I was wrong. For the first time in his 30-year career, Hargrove felt small. He called the Judicial Council, his voice hoarse, defeated. I'm resigning, he said. But I want to help fix this. I want to be part of the solution. The next day, Hargrove appeared at a small council meeting, no longer wearing his judge's robe. I didn't see my own bias, he said, his eyes red-rimmed, his voice filled with remorse. Karoline Leavitt. She opened my eyes. I want to join the training program to help ensure that no one else repeats my mistakes. Linda nodded, noting that Hargrove's willingness to acknowledge his wrongdoing and participate in the reform process could be useful. The news spread, sparking a national debate. Some on X mocked Hargrove's sudden change of heart, calling it a cynical attempt to save face, but others expressed support, praising him for admitting his fault. At least he's owning up to it, one person wrote. That's rare these days. Karoline, back in her office, received an email from Linda Martinez. Hargrove resigned. He's agreed to participate in the training. You changed him, Karoline. You really did. She glanced at the silver cross in the mirror, a small, quiet smile playing on her lips. The case she'd originally come to observe, the Christian group suing the government for the right to pray in public, had become almost a footnote, a small part of a much larger, more significant story. She had turned an ordinary day, an unexpected confrontation, into a catalyst for change, a spark that had ignited a national movement, not just for Hargrove, but for the entire judicial system. Just 4 days after the incident at the D.C. local court, the atmosphere in Washington had shifted noticeably. Karoline Leavitt stood in her White House office, gazing out the window at Pennsylvania Avenue. The silver cross on her navy blazer collar still shone brightly, now a symbol of a movement far bigger than she could have ever imagined. Her phone buzzed constantly, messages from Trump, from conservative leaders, from everyday people thanking her for speaking up, for standing strong. An email from the D.C. Judicial Council arrived. New regulations issued for all D.C. courts. No bans on religious symbols, unless they genuinely disrupt proceedings. Mandatory First Amendment training for all staff, from judges to clerks. Thank you, Miss Leavitt, she smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile, knowing this victory wasn't hers alone. After the lightning-fast investigation, the council had issued sweeping new rules for all D.C. courts. A new plaque was placed outside the courthouse, inscribed with the words, "Religious freedom, a right beyond violation." Karoline saw the news on X, where #CrossingCourt was still trending. D.C. changes laws, thanks to Karoline Leavitt, one post declared. Charles Hargrove, no longer a judge, appeared at the first training session for court staff. He stood before dozens of his former colleagues, his voice raspy, but sincere. "I thought I was being fair," he said. "But I was wrong. Karoline Leavitt taught me to look at myself, to examine my own biases. Don't let prejudice blind you to justice." The crowd was quiet, respectful, some nodding in agreement. Mrs. Thompson, now appointed to oversee the court's transparency program, sat in the front row, taking meticulous notes. James Wilson, leading the training for court bailiffs, added, "We're the eyes and ears of the court. If we see injustice, we must speak up." Leavitt did, and so must we. Hargrove watched them, a flicker of hope in his eyes, knowing that he was, in his own small way, contributing to a more just, a more equitable system. Karoline hung the $500 fine receipt, now framed, on her White House office wall. It wasn't just a memento. It was a reminder of the power of one person to stand up for what's right, to challenge injustice, to make a difference. Trump walked in, clapping her on the shoulder. "You're a star, Karoline, a true star. The religious freedom crowd loves you, and so do I." He laughed heartily, his voice booming. "We just won big. Keep the momentum going." She nodded, already preparing for her next speech, a major address at a conservative event in Virginia, where thousands were waiting to hear the White House legal genius speak. The incident's impact stretched far beyond the borders of D.C. states like Texas, Florida, and Ohio began reviewing their own court rules and procedures regarding religious expression. The governor of Texas tweeted, "Thank you, Karoline Leavitt, for reminding us of the importance of religious freedom. Texas will follow your lead." A group of Florida lawyers filed a petition demanding similar First Amendment training for all court personnel, citing the #CrossingCourt case as precedent. On X, people began posting photos of themselves wearing crosses, Islamic badges, Buddhist bracelets, and other symbols of their faith, captioned with messages like, "My freedom, no one can ban it. #CrossingCourt. Karoline read these posts, her heart swelling with pride. She hadn't expected a single courtroom moment to ignite such a widespread, powerful movement. The next day, Karoline stood on a stage in Virginia, facing a crowd of 5,000 people, waving banners that read, "Religious freedom now, and stand with Karoline." "That day," she said, her voice amplified by the speakers, carrying across the vast. "That day, I just wanted to do my job," Karoline continued, her voice carrying across the vast crowd in Virginia, the energy palpable. "But when a judge fined me for my faith, I couldn't stay silent. I knew I had to speak up, not just for myself, but for all of you, for everyone who believes in the fundamental right to religious freedom. This isn't just my win, it's ours." The crowd roared its approval, a wave of applause and cheers washing over her. Some shouted, "Karoline for president!" She smiled, waving, the camera flashes popping like a constellation of stars. The silver cross on her neck gleamed, catching the light, becoming a viral image across social media, dubbed by the press as the symbol of resilience. Back in D.C., Mrs. Thompson oversaw the implementation of the new record-keeping system in the local courts. Every fine imposed was now meticulously documented, categorized, and reviewed monthly for any signs of bias. James Wilson, leading training sessions for young, newly recruited bailiffs, stressed the importance of vigilance and courage. "Don't be afraid to speak out," he told them. "Karoline Leavitt did, and so must we. We are the guardians of fairness in the courtroom." One evening, Karoline received a handwritten letter from Linda Martinez, the lead investigator in the Hargrove case. "You didn't just change Hargrove," Linda wrote. "You changed the system. Thank you, Karoline. Your courage has made a real difference." She set the letter down, her eyes lingering on the framed $500 fine receipt on her wall, reflecting on the extraordinary journey. From one unexpected, seemingly insignificant courtroom confrontation to this nationwide wave of reform. Trump called her at 9 p.m., his voice booming with enthusiasm. "Karoline, you're my gold standard," he declared. "The opposition is panicking, and we're winning big on religious freedom. Rest up, though. We've got more battles ahead." She laughed, a genuine, heartfelt laugh. "Thank you, Mr. President. I'm ready." Hanging up, she sat for a moment, touching the silver cross, feeling its smooth, cool surface against her skin. From a simple, personal accessory, it had become something far greater. A symbol of hope, a beacon of change, a testament to the power of one individual to make a profound impact. 3 months later, Karoline Leavitt stood at the White House podium, camera flashes firing nonstop. The silver cross on her navy blazer collar gleamed, now a familiar, almost iconic symbol to millions across the country. Before her stood a diverse group of reporters, TikTok influencers, and representatives from various religious communities, all eagerly awaiting her remarks on the progress of religious freedom initiatives. 3 months ago, she began, her voice echoing through the briefing room. "I just wanted to do my job, to observe a court case. But when a judge fined me for wearing a cross, a symbol of my faith, I knew I had to stand up. Not just for myself, but for all of you. And today, because of that stand, because of the collective efforts of so many, we've changed the system." The crowd clapped, some holding signs with the now ubiquitous hashtag #HatCrossingCourt. Outside the D.C. local court, a new plaque had been installed in the lobby, a permanent reminder of the transformative events that had unfolded there. It read, "Justice honors all faiths." Karoline had recently received a letter from a young law student, a letter that touched her deeply. "Miss Leavitt," the student wrote, "I was scared to fight for what I believed in, but your cross case gave me courage. I'm starting a free legal clinic to help people who have been discriminated against because of their faith. Thank you for inspiring me." Karoline read the letter that night, alone in her office, a soft smile gracing her lips. She knew she'd inspired the next generation of defenders of freedom. Charles Hargrove, now a volunteer instructor at legal ethics workshops, stood before a class, his voice carrying the weight of experience and remorse. "I was wrong once," he admitted. "Karoline Leavitt taught me a valuable lesson. Justice has no room for bias. We must uphold the law fairly and impartially, for everyone." Mrs. Thompson and James Wilson continued their work, diligently monitoring court proceedings, ensuring transparency and accountability. Trump called her frequently, his voice always filled with a mixture of admiration and strategic calculation. "Karoline, you're my warrior. Keep fighting the good fight." She nodded over the phone, feeling a sense of duty, a sense of purpose that extended far beyond her role as White House press secretary. One evening, as the sun set over Washington, D.C., Karoline stood on the White House balcony, gazing out at the city lights. She held the silver cross in her hand, feeling its weight, its significance. It was no longer just a keepsake. It was the flame she'd ignited, a flame that had spread from a small, cramped courtroom across the entire nation. "Freedom doesn't come free," she whispered to herself. "It takes courage, it takes fighters." A message arrived on her phone. The National Judicial Reform Commission wanted her to lead a nationwide initiative to promote fairness and impartiality in the courts. She smiled, ready for the next challenge, ready to continue the fight. From one unexpected day, she'd reshaped laws, inspired countless others, and proven that one person, one belief, one act of courage can shake the world. And new article, "The Power of One: How a Single Act of Courage Can Spark a National Movement." The story of Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary who challenged a judge's bias against her religious symbol, is more than just a headline-grabbing news event. It's a powerful testament to the enduring strength of individual conviction and the ripple effect it can have on society. In a world often dominated by cynicism and apathy, Karoline's story reminds us that one person, armed with courage, knowledge, and a willingness to speak truth to power, can truly make a difference. Her refusal to back down, her meticulous documentation of the judge's actions, and her skillful use of legal precedent and social media turned a seemingly minor incident into a national conversation about religious freedom, judicial bias, and the importance of upholding the First Amendment. The Stride Crossing Court movement, born from a single act of defiance, demonstrated the power of collective action, amplified by the reach of the internet and the support of a powerful political figure. But the story's significance goes even deeper. It highlights the crucial role of individuals within institutions, like Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, and James Wilson, the bailiff, who, inspired by Karoline's courage, chose to break their silence and expose a long-standing pattern of injustice. It also shows the potential for redemption and reform, even in those who have erred, as evidenced by Judge Hargrove's eventual resignation and his commitment to promoting fairness in the judicial system. It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to stand up for what we believe in, to challenge injustice wherever we find it, and to use our voices, our skills, and our resources to create a more just and equitable world. It's a lesson in the power of one, the power of one person, one belief, one act of courage, to ignite a movement and change the course of history. What do you think? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a situation where one person's courage made a significant difference? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories and insightful analysis.